Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to talk about how one of the most unexpected presidents in U.S. history, Harry S. Truman, was thrown into the deep end and ended up shaping the next 50 years of global conflict, what we now call the Cold War.
Okay, just imagine for a second. You're the vice president, and you've been kept out of the loop on all the big secrets. Then, out of nowhere, the president dies. Suddenly, you're in charge of ending a world war and staring down a new global superpower. Well, for Harry Truman, that wasn't just some crazy thought experiment. That was his reality.
So, it's April 1945. World War II is still absolutely raging in the Pacific when the nation gets the shocking news that President Franklin D. Roosevelt is dead. Truman, who'd only been VP for a few months, is sworn in. He inherits not just a country at war, but secrets he knew nothing about, including the biggest secret of them all, the Manhattan Project.
Now, during the war, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies, right? But let's be real, it was an alliance of convenience. The only thing they truly agreed on was that Nazi Germany had to be defeated. Once that common enemy was gone, all the deep-seated mistrust that had been bubbling under the surface, well, it was about to boil over.
And this wasn't just some political disagreement. Nope. The post-war world was quickly turning into a battleground for two completely opposite ways of life. Two totally different visions for how the world should work.
And this slide, right here, this is basically the engine of the entire Cold War. On one side, you have the American system, capitalism, free elections, individual rights. On the other, you have the Soviet model, communism, a single-party state, and total government control. And here's the kicker. Both sides were absolutely convinced that their system was the future, and the other was a direct threat to their very existence.
And it didn't take long for this tension to show up on the map. The first real flashpoint was Eastern Europe. As the Soviet Red Army pushed the Nazis back, Stalin started setting up friendly communist governments in their place. He called it a buffer zone for security. But from where Truman was sitting in Washington, it didn't look like defense. It looked a lot like an empire being built, one country at a time.
So Truman's looking at the map, seeing all this red spreading, and he knows he can't just sit back and watch. His administration needed a game plan, a grand strategy. And what they came up with, well, it would become the playbook for American foreign policy for the next 40 years. And that game plan was called containment. The name really says it all. The idea wasn't to roll back communism where it already was. Nobody wanted to risk starting World War III. Instead, the goal was to contain it, to build a kind of geopolitical wall around the Soviet Union and its allies to stop communism from spreading anywhere else.
The first time they put this idea into practice was a really big deal. It was called the Truman Doctrine. Truman went to Congress and basically announced a radical new foreign policy. If you're a free country fighting off a communist takeover, America has your back. And just like that, with aid flowing to Greece and Turkey, containment went from a theory on paper to real-world action.
But here's the really clever part. Containment wasn't just about guns and soldiers. It was also about money. The Marshall Plan was this massive aid program to rebuild Western Europe. The thinking was brilliant and pretty simple. Hungry, desperate people might find communism appealing. But a country with a booming economy and a hopeful future? That's the best defense against Soviet influence you could ask for.
Okay, so you've got the policy, you've got the economic plan, but a plan is just a plan until it gets tested. And Truman's containment strategy was about to face some serious, high-stakes crises that would show whether it could actually work.
And the first major crisis blew up in the city of Berlin. Now you have to remember, Berlin was split, but the whole city was located deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. This made West Berlin a little island of democracy in a sea of communism. Stalin figured he could just squeeze it to death. He cut off every road, every railway, every canal leading to the city. So now, Truman's in a serious bind. What do? Send in the tanks to break the blockade and risk starting World War III? Or give up West Berlin and show the world that America's promises are worthless? It seemed like an impossible choice. But Truman, he found a third option, a crazy, audacious plan nobody saw coming.
The Berlin Airlift. For almost a whole year, American and British planes flew supplies into West Berlin around the clock. We're talking everything from food and medicine to coal for heat. It was an absolutely incredible achievement, a huge propaganda victory for the West, and, frankly, a total public embarrassment for Stalin. He eventually had no choice but to lift the blockade.
But just as the West was celebrating this huge win in Berlin, containment got hit with a devastating blow over in Asia.
In 1949, after a long civil war, China, the most populous country on the planet, fell to Mao Zedong's communist forces. This loss of China sent absolute shockwaves through Washington and stoked fears that communism was this unstoppable global force on the march.
So far, it had been a Cold War, a war of words, economics, and threats. But that was all about to change. On a small peninsula in Asia, the Cold War was about to turn hot, sparking the first major proxy war of this new era.
It all kicked off in June 1950. North Korea, with backing from the Soviets and the Chinese, stormed across the border into South Korea. Truman saw this as a blatant test of containment, and boom, U.S. troops were sent in under a UN flag. This was it, the first time American soldiers were actually fighting and dying to stop the spread of communism. The war dragged on into a brutal stalemate and ended up cementing the division of Korea that we still live with today.
So you think about it. When Truman left office in 1953, the world was a completely different place than the one he'd inherited just 8 years before. The global chessboard had been totally reset, and he was the one who had defined the new rules of the game.
And hanging over all of this was the terrifying shadow of the atomic bomb. For a few short years, America was the only country that had one, but that monopoly ended in 1949 when the Soviets tested their own bomb. And that, right there, kicked off the nuclear arms race, a decades-long, unbelievably expensive, and frankly terrifying competition for nuclear superiority.
And to make the battle lines crystal clear, Truman helped create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a complete game changer. It was a formal military alliance that basically said an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. This locked in the U.S. commitment to defending Western Europe. The lines in the sand had been drawn. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, it's pretty clear. Truman's decisions really did write the rule book for the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the intervention in Korea. He established the core policies, the alliances, and the precedents that would guide American presidents for the next 40 years. Which leaves us with this huge question, one that historians still argue about today. Was the Cold War just inevitable? With these two clashing ideologies, was a conflict always going to happen? Or were there key moments, key decisions made by Truman that set us on this specific decades-long path? It's what makes this whole era so fascinating to explore.